you all having a good day? Yes? It's a bit early to think of the answers to such things, maybe. This is a big moment for me because it's the first time I've spoken at GDC, and I've been making games for about 30 years. And what I'm going to do is, maybe you need to have something to say, really. I think what I've got to say is very important. I'm going to take you on a journey that started when I was, well, not when I was, but 20 years ago. It's the 20th anniversary of Kickoff this year. 20 years ago means there's actually probably quite a few in the audience who weren't even born when Kickoff got released. But that's the reason why I'm here at all. And Kickoff was a football game that had a major impact at the time. And it was my first attempt at making a game that, was of a real commercial nature. And I started wondering what it was that I did that caused Kickoff to have the success that it had. And I'm basically going to take you from that question to where I've arrived just recently. And now we wait for the wonderful technology of... I really don't like computers very much. My laptop appears to have locked up. That's really good. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to see if I can... No, it hasn't locked up. So, right, let's see. Good. So at the moment, I'm teaching video game programming at the IGAD, that stands for International Game Architecture and Design course, NHTV in Breda, and getting quite a lot out of teaching students about video game development. But where I'm going to start is with the question that eventually popped out in my search for understanding what it was that I did. Was this question: what is design? It's been said that if you take a room full of designers and you ask them to tell you what design is, that you will get as many answers as there are people in the room. And I've never really been very happy with that. I think we need to be able to answer the question, what is design? So I'm going to attempt to do that. So I'm going to jump straight to the conclusion and then, bridge the gap. I think design is simply the management of constraints. I'm not going to go into here how I came to that conclusion. I like definitions to be useful. I argue that this is actually an extremely useful definition. I can use it to describe to anybody what it is that I do as a designer. That's fundamental core. A lot has been said about the detail of design, about design patterns, about, you can do this or you can do that. But in the end, what do you do as a designer? I say, you manage constraints. And using this, I can talk to students, I can talk to you, I can talk to customers. I've tried it, it works. But you might not agree with me yet, but what I'll ask you to do is, can you just humor me? Just come along for the ride and see what you think. So if I'm right and the process of design is the management of constraints, I need to define what a constraint is. And I will give you a definition of constraints in this context a little bit later. But let's start with two types: negotiable constraints and non-negotiable constraints. The difference between the two, probably you can intuitively already guess. But I'm going to exactly specify the difference between the two, and the importance, particularly, of the non-negotiable constraints, and why you should pay a great deal of attention to non-negotiable constraints. In the beginning, it's all negotiable. Before you even sign the contract, That's why you negotiate contracts. In the beginning, there are infinite possibilities, but there's zero identity. This is usually the case before a project starts, or in fact it is. Even if you're a designer and you're idly thinking while you're on a train journey or on a flight or something about an idea, a concept, you get a bit of inspiration, you've already started the design process. But the moment that you think of an idea, two things are happening. One is an identity is forming, and the other one is that possibilities are being reduced. Just hold on to that thought. The difference between the two, sorry, I went back one somehow. So first of all, right, the designer must start identifying and selecting the non-negotiable constraints. And I'm going to go through this process for kickoff because I remember the decisions that I made, the key decisions that I made. I actually remember making them, practically where I was sitting at the time. So here is the starting point. Probably you can take three constraints, the classic ones: time, budget, and specification. And at the beginning, they're all negotiable. And so as you start negotiating with your client, you might agree on some time, a budget, and eventually, well, specification, the client isn't going to give you all the specification. If the client gives you absolutely every bit of detail, you've got no designing to do. So generally what happens is some specification is given to you, but not enough to actually complete the job, complete the identity of what you're making. But already possibilities are being reduced and identity is increasing. So, as I said, a long time ago I made a football game for the Atari ST and then ported it to other platforms. It was called Kickoff. And so I've got to show you what happened. I went to Anil Gupta, who passed away a few years ago, because he was happened to be near where I was living. And we started talking about what kind of game I could make, and basically he said, Atari ST, or Amiga, actually, but I chose ST because that's the computer I had at that moment. Football game. So I identified immediately the key requirements of the customer. And everything else is negotiable at that point. So of course, as the designer, what I have to do is start pushing more stuff into the non-negotiable category. Turn off the network there. I bet you the focus has gone. So what I have to do is start choosing my own non-negotiable constraints. Increasing the identity of my design while reducing the possibilities. Here they are. There were 6. Now, of course, I didn't do the process at the time thinking all of this. This is looking back at it. There were 6 non-negotiable constraints, and these all survived to the completion of the product. So I'm going to briefly run through them. 50 frames per second, because I was in Europe, otherwise it would have been 60 frames per second. Because a long time ago I learned that if you actually animate at 25 frames per second, you get a double imaging. Just as a matter of interest, how many of you know what I'm talking about when I say that? Oh, man, that is great. You don't know how happy that makes me, because I feel like a madman sometimes talking about this 25 frames a second, you get this double imaging, people's eyes glaze over, you know, things. What's it going on about? What's he talking about? Well, I learned that when I was making a game on the Acorn Atom. I was doing my first animation at full speed using, writing in assembler, and I noticed this effect. And so from that point on, I made it a non-negotiable constraint for the games that I made that they should run at the frame rate of the TV screen, if we want to specify it properly, in this case 50 frames per second. So that's what I was going to do with this game. Now, that was the first constraint, actually. But then, of course, that's not enough. I looked at other football games out there at the time, and a very common theme was really small football pitches with really large players. I don't know if you remember. When I went to the Acorn User Exhibition way back, one of them, there was an asteroids game. This is the experience. I'm connecting it to an experience, an asteroids game, and it had a big triangle like that for the ship. But already a portent of things to come. It was a big triangle, much bigger than in the original arcade game. And I tried playing this, and I went, it's just like I feel so claustrophobic. It's not going to work. It didn't work. It wasn't fun. They made the ship bigger, but they made the universe smaller. So, that alerted me to the concepts of scale. And so basically, I wanted to have a correct scale football pitch. So the players would be relative to the pitch, just like it is in real life, as close as I could get. But there was another constraint. The other constraint was sprites should not be too small. Later on, a competitor came and made the game Sensible Soccer. They ignored that constraint, although they stuck to all the others. I didn't have the courage to do that, even though I kind of felt that it might be good, because I didn't think the game would sell. I didn't think I could sell the idea of small sprites. So the sprites didn't have to be too small. But if you think about it, this immediately starts to form some of the apparent decisions of design people ask me about, and they say, well, why did you choose an overhead view? Why is the camera so close to the field? Because I picked those two constraints. And so the only way to make it work that you have a big football field and sprites that aren't too small and everything to scale, you're going to have to bring the camera down close. And I had to actually solve the technical problems of having really large scrolling field. Yeah, can you see that? Air friction. There are some football games out there, I won't mention who they are, but they actually don't have air friction. Probably the reason is because you can't actually aim the ball. When you kick and the goalkeeper saves, they actually kick the ball into the goalkeeper's hands. This is quite difficult to do if you've got air friction. So I'm hypothesizing that's why some of the modern football games don't have air friction. But on the particular game I'm thinking about, you may notice that if there's a ball coming like this and lands near the edge of the goal line, it does a weird vertical bounce that doesn't really look very genuine. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Anyone seen it? 1. 2. Do we have any advance on 2? 2? Okay. It comes like this, and instead of bouncing, as you expect, it bounces vertically. That's a hack that was put in this game, I surmise, to prevent the problem of the ball keeping on going out of play. If you don't have air friction in football, the goalkeeper could kick the ball right from one end of the field to sort of like maybe 2 field lengths. So it's important. So I put air friction. I had to solve problems because I had air friction. No glue foot. This is probably the most important thing, the identifying mark of the football game. Because other games at the time, when you dribbled with the football, soccer, right, it kind of stuck to you. And I said, this doesn't make sense. The ball is not stuck to the player. Essential part of football is the fact that, in fact, it is football, not carry ball or handball, right? And last one was no cheating the shots, meaning that you actually aimed, that the player used skill to aim the shots. So here's the thing. If you look at this list, you actually see the identity of kickoff. Can you see that? And these constraints survived all the way through the development process, which took 15 months. And I did all the programming and the design myself. And at the end of the 15 months, they were intact. This is significant. It is constraints that give form to a design. This is the conclusion of this so far, the conclusion of the journey. No, there's not conclusion, there's more to come. But the constraints are the thing that give form to a design, and this is universally true, not just game design, it's true of anything. In fact, that's the revelation, if it is, at least revelation to me, maybe it isn't to you, I don't know, that's the significance of constraints. In fact, it's so true of everything. It's true of me and you, your bodies. If you didn't have bones to support the structure, you'd be a blob on the floor. You would have less identity. The thing that defines us is the constraints that give us our identity. Can you just think about that a minute? Constraints, the thing that we are supposed to be fighting against all the time, is actually the thing that you use as a designer to design. It is the building blocks of design. Because as a designer, you're creating identity. And it's so universally true that even something like a small bit of matter here, what is this coin, apart from a euro? Right? Well, Einstein, he showed us that matter is the same as energy. We could, if we had the correct technology, convert this coin into just pure energy, and it would be worth more than a euro, the energy, which I find interesting as well. But what will have happened to the coin? Converted into energy, it's lost all its constraints. This coin is constrained energy, and the constraints are what give the coin its identity. Do you see how universal this is? Now, we go on a bit because we have to get onto the idea of quality, right? Now, how do we make a good design? So, I'm throwing this out there. The quality of a design thus depends on how well chosen the constraints are. How do we know when something is good? Kind of important question. So Steve Jobs had something to say about this. Is everybody familiar with this? Probably everyone in this room has seen this quote. And there's been some speculation over what does it actually mean. Well, I'm going to tell you in my kind of arrogant way. Here's my quote. It's a bit clumsy because I'm trying to stick to the same phraseology. But you know a good person when you want to like them. You could argue, well, when you find a good person, you just like them automatically. But but hopefully you get the point. Like and lick may actually come from the same root word, the same, whatever, etymology or whatever the word is. So to explain what Steve Jobs meant by that, when you want to lick something, it means it's something that's good, you think is good for consumption. No? Does that make sense? How do you assess when something's good for consumption? Well, we are, as human beings, very sensitive to the integrity of things. So that's where the integrity comes in design, constraints, and integrity. We're very, very good at it. Whether it's food presented to us at the table of a restaurant, or whether it's the character of a person, or whether it's a video game. And we're sensitive to it without even knowing why. One thing I find quite amazing is how there can be sympathetic evil characters. Like everyone's seen The Dark Knight, so you've got this Joker character, okay, and he's utterly evil, but somehow manages to get some kind of sympathy from the audience somehow. So my belief is that works purely because, as evil as the Joker is, he's got really high integrity. Because his form doesn't change. It sticks to his rules. And we like that. We like that so much that we can even sometimes overlook other things because of it. It's kind of interesting. In fact, you could say in the battle of that film, in that story, the Joker holds up his integrity more than Batman. Kind of interesting, I think. Things that have a strong identity, we like things that have a strong identity, okay? And a strong identity requires a strong integrity. This is, there's no way around this. I mean, the integrity of this glass is determined by the constraints that bind together the things that make this glass up. If I go take this glass and I hit it with a hammer and pulp it down until it's sand again, there's been a loss of integrity. It's no longer a glass. We like things that have a strong integrity. Without integrity, things lose their identity and they become less desirable. So I think this is very important because we're looking for successful designs, aren't we? And I don't have a silver bullet, but I do have the lead trap or the pitfall, the thing that will guarantee failure, the thing you should avoid. I think pretty much as I've looked at it, all successful designs demonstrate a strong identity. Even successful companies. I like to use Starbucks. Gosh, there's an integrity in Starbucks. It even goes into the name. Star, as in quality, bucks, as in money. They built their empire on the concept of the integrity of their coffee. In the beginning, there is nothing. That black square up there represents infinite possibility and zero identity, unless you argue about the black square having an identity, but then we get into sort of modern art and stuff, I suppose. But then I draw a line across the space, and what I've done is I've increased the identity, but I've also reduced the possibilities. I'm trying to abstract sense, show the process at work. I can add more and more things. Those lines are interacting, they're touching each other, they depend upon each other. If I carry on doing this, it's not meant to be artistically interesting. But here we have a pattern. And this pattern has a design, some design rules in it. It's entirely made of triangles. And there are no quads in there. And the vertices, nearby vertices are all joined up. So if we change that and just sort of remove one line, I don't know about you, but for me, that has detracted somehow from the quality, not that it's really meaningful in any way, but the quality of the pattern. Perhaps subtle. Maybe just with one change, the exception becomes the thing that gives it its identity. Maybe. But what about if you do this? I mean, that hurts. I'm a musician as well, right? So if I hear music that's really bad or annoying in some way, I can't take it. But in a sense, this is the same thing. I couldn't live with that. It's like the most discordant chord that you could imagine, isn't it? It's what's happened is that line that I moved. Actually, there's a jump. Yeah, sorry, there's two changes there because all I've done is just move one line. But the line that I moved was the first line that I drew. It was, in effect, a non-negotiable constraint. I changed a fundamental constraint that gave identity to what I was doing, to what I was making. And I see this kind of thing happen in the video game industry. I mean, let's say you're working on a game and it's supposed to be a robot fighting game. And, I'm kind of drawing on actual real-life experiences. It wasn't a robot fighting game, right? But let's say you are. And so at the beginning, you go through this process, this design process. You decide, what the schedule is, what team is going to work on it, what kind of genre of game, and you say, all right, robot fighting game, okay, and so you start making more decisions that depend upon those decisions, those key decisions that will give identity to your product. And then after 6 months development, the marketing department come back and they say, well, we've done some research and we've come to the conclusion that robot fighting games don't sell. So we think we've got a bit of a problem. So we're wondering, could you make it about teddy bears instead? And although it sounds ludicrous, it's actually not so far from reality. The problem is, you can't do that. It's like trying to move that line. You have to start again. What's happened is that a non-negotiable constraint that is going to give the identity to the very thing that you're trying to create, you're just pulling it away. You're destroying the identity of the thing you are making. This might seem obvious, I don't know, but one of the points I'm trying to make is if you can develop a way of talking about this stuff, maybe in a meeting with a client or with the people running your company, maybe it's possible to have a little bit more of a rational decision-making process where these things are actually considered. And you can say, look, if we change this thing that you want to change, you are changing the ultimate identity of the game, and this will guarantee failure unless we rethink the whole thing. You can change it, but you're changing the identity, and if you don't do that carefully, the failure in integrity will be apparent to the consumer, and the consumer will not buy your product. So I'm going to move on to some definitions that I promised. So I'm trying to define every term I use. So I was starting off with really a trivial one, a concept. I needed something to pin things onto. So a concept is something which can be made or achieved. Okay, fine, that's trivial. Now, the next one, design. Now, I gave a definition of design as a process. The process is the management of constraints. This is the definition of design as a product. This is what a designer makes. And I think a designer makes a collection of decisions that creates a set of constraints which give a concept its identity. And my integrity meter gives a nice little kick of approval for me on that definition. When you have a designer working on your game, that's what they're creating, not a design document per se, although a design document can contain that. But this is actually what is being created, isn't it? And the concept identity is the true nature of the concept which may or may not match the intentions of the designer. So generally, a designer will want to actually create something that matches what was intended. There is the connection with the integrity. If you break the non-negotiable constraints, you can end up with a mismatch. If you do it casually, I mean, I talk about this with my students, and they say, well, you say non-negotiable constraints, but non-negotiable constraints are really negotiable, aren't they? And I had to work on how to answer that. I'll answer it here. Definition of constraint. A rule that reduces the possible outcomes of the concept and contributes to its identity. Imagine, if you will, I know we saw the picture, but it's actually a good exercise if you close your eyes and you just picture a three-dimensional void, a three-dimensional cube, almost like a block of marble. Designers are really sculptors. You've got this three-dimensional block of possibility, and the first constraint, the designer perceives the first constraint, and now a kind of blinding shaft cuts across this three-dimensional block of possibility and divides it into everything that is now compatible with that constraint and everything that is not. And then the next decision is made, and that cuts across. And what you carry on doing is doing this until the union of all those constraints is the thing that you have designed. That is the identity that you have created. It is sculpting. In fact, if a sculptor takes a block of marble, goes with a chisel, and knocks a piece off intentionally or otherwise, that has put a constraint on what the sculptor can sculpt, hasn't it? In video games, we're quite lucky because we can undo what we do. You know, if we change our minds, we have fewer constraints. But that actually makes design more difficult. We have a non-negotiable constraint and a non-negotiable constraints and negotiable constraints. A constraint which, if broken, would cause a significant change to the identity of a design is currently my definition of a non-negotiable constraint. So it's only non-negotiable if the identity of what you're trying to make is non-negotiable. And negotiable constraints are constraints which may be applied or not, depending on taste or circumstances, but are not crucial to the identity of the concept. They're important, but that's where you get, the ability to make decisions that are not critical to the whole reason you're designing in the first place. And integrity, definition of integrity, is quite simply how well something maintains its identity. Now, I tend to try and make connections between various concepts, as you may well have gathered. You can apply this to humans. Okay, what defines you as a person? Because I started thinking about that. What defines me as a person? My character. And I came to the conclusion it's the non-negotiable constraints I live by. That creates my identity. I believe I'm a person who, if I walk down the street and I find €1,000 lying there, okay, I'm going to pick up the €1,000, take it to a police station. That is the mental picture of the kind of person I am. The day that I come across €1,000 lying in the street, this will be tested. And I'm not so naive as to think, because I know the fallibility of human nature, the fallibility of myself. 1,000, 10,000, did I say 1,000? It was 10,000 I was thinking. €10,000. If I give in, if I take the €10,000 and don't take it to the police station, I've changed who I am. I'm not the same person anymore. That's what integrity really is, and that's why it's important. I was thinking about the €10,000. So, we have seen how successful designs always have integrity. I mean, don't take my word for it. Go look. Everybody see that film, Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull? What was that? There was a call of people who said no, they hadn't seen it, or was it a lone voice out there that groaned? I'm not sure, but do you know where I'm heading with this? Who liked Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull? Come on, don't be shy. Oh, come on. Did nobody like it at all? Who didn't like Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull? Yeah, I agree with you. It was awful. I couldn't bear it. Because it didn't have integrity. And successful by, I don't know, let's say, Lord of the Rings. The films, Lord of the Rings. They were great. Who liked Lord of the Rings? Yeah. It's easy, isn't it? Why? I tell you what the secret was to the success of the film of Lord of the Rings. They used the book as a non-negotiable constraint, more or less. But that is actually the key to it. They didn't, just for convenience sake, change that. Any deviations they made would have been very carefully considered. Because a lack of integrity results in a lack of identity, and a strong identity is essential. And so what you have is a recipe for not guaranteeing failure. And honestly, I've seen it. You've been around. I mean, as long as I have in the industry. I've survived 30 years in the industry. I don't know how. But you see things that scar you forever. And you see them enough and you see the pattern, okay? So if you want to guarantee not to fail, sort of, choose your non-negotiable constraints well. And realize that that starts right at the beginning. Of course, someone might ask, well, how do you do that? You find a good designer. Designers have an ability to choose those initial non-negotiable constraints that create an identity which is good. Actually, it's the same as cooking. What makes a good chef? What makes a good creator of anything? That's beyond the scope of this talk. But you know what you've got to aim for? You've got to aim for choosing those non-negotiable constraints well. And probably equally important to this, you must stick to them. That is very important. That's the integrity right there. That's the second stumbling block of projects that fail. And the third point is, if you find you need to change the non-negotiable constraints, hey, it can happen. You know why? Well, because non-negotiable constraints can be in conflict. And when that happens, you've got a big problem to solve. But the good news is, you know what the consequences of solving it are. You know what you need to think about. When you find non-negotiable constraints, the conflict, you need to think, what is the identity of my product? You bring that into focus. So that when you solve this problem, you do not damage the identity of what you're making too much. Now, actually, I think that designers do all this instinctively. Good designers do everything that I'm talking about instinctively. What I'm trying to do is be able to talk about it. That's all. Have a language. I need to be able to figure out how to teach students how to design things, you know? Although I teach programming, right? But it's all design. Even programming is design. Even organizing our own lives is design. How this room was laid out. Decisions everywhere. Everywhere there's a decision that needs to be made, there's design going on. It's like the Matrix. Yeah? When you pay your taxes. You know, whatever. Constraints are your ally. So that's interesting, because especially young aspiring game developers tend to view constraints as a bad thing. They don't want to be constrained. They want their imaginations to soar. They have all these big ideas. Dangerous. Constraints are the building blocks of design, I argue. Therefore, if you hate constraints, you're in a hiding to nothing. You've got to love constraints. And I do. I love it when I have to design something that has lots of constraints. You know why? It's going to be a quick job. The search space for a solution is made smaller on every constraint. And that's why it's harder to make games these days than it was. Fun games, eh? Or any game, maybe. There's been a tendency as the barriers, the technological constraints have fallen down, you'd expect an explosion of creativity. It doesn't happen that way. And the reason it doesn't happen is because now there are more decisions to make. A lesson there is, you know, you can always constrain yourself. Self-discipline, that's the thing. You know, it's like discipline is the thing. It builds character and all that. Colonel Harty, I can't do the voice anymore. Jungle Book. It's taken me 44 years to figure out what the concept of self-discipline meant in terms of character. Self-discipline, integrity, character, identity. 44 years to figure that out. I feel kind of ashamed. So, constraints, they give form to what you do. You've got to choose them wisely, you have to stick with them. And this applies as much to your own life as it does to video games, incidentally. I've already covered what defines what you are. or who you are. I've already done that. Yeah, there's constraints you live by. Because, without integrity, you become nothing by definition. But if you follow the logic that I'm saying, if you don't have integrity, then you don't have any constraints. If you don't have any constraints, then you don't have any identity. Yeah. And that applies to your game design, right? The only thing an anarchist can be is an anarchist. You can't find anarchist doctors or anarchist policemen or anarchist game designers. Because if you throw all the constraints away, you become nothing. You have to stick to your constraints and change them not for the sake of convenience, but with careful thought. I'm kind of summing up now. Careful thought as to how it will affect the identity of the thing that you are trying to make. And this applies whether you're designing a video game or a company or a code base or a chair or your life. It applies everywhere. And I think this is I find it personally incredibly powerful. And I hope you find it of value too. And that's it. Thanks. I think we've got some time for some questions. Let me just check. 6 minutes. So any questions? Yeah.
I like your lines example very much. And wouldn't it be a great way to willingly violate bar constraints or non-negotiable constraints to create a need in the player?
Yes. So I think the question there is it valid to break a non-negotiable constraint in order to create tension in the player? And that's, of course, very true. In fact, that happens all the time. It's a technique actually used in film, isn't it? That you expect everything to work. Oh yes, we all agree this is the way things are meant to be. And then suddenly you go wham, and you introduce something that doesn't fit, and then it creates a shock. But that was part of the design plan, so it's all right. It's a bit fractal, but yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any rule of thumbs on the number of constraints you work with? Like 10, 5, 100?
How many? Every single time you make a decision, when I was saying the plane that cuts across, every single decision that you make is a constraint. So the answer is how many, the thing to think about is how many decisions exist in making a video game? Right? I mean, I don't think we can even count them. Video games are so complicated. It's just every artist makes 100 decisions a day, every programmer 100 decisions a day. And the real difficulty is these all impact the design. So what I can say, though, is that the more constraints that you add, the fewer decisions you're going to have to make in the future. That I could say, until eventually, because the end result, right, is one possibility. That's what you deliver. It's the one possibility, and a complete identity. So you've gone from the beginning, from zero identity to infinite possibility to one possibility and a firm identity. And you need as many decisions as it takes.
When you start a project, first I think you have the biggest constraint you have. I mean, you have to stick to it, so you can't change this one.
I think that's fair. You say, I'm going to do a football game. There we are. That is already a non-negotiable constraint, okay? And the really fascinating thing is that where do original ideas come from? They actually come from a weird space that's outside of kind of logic and intellect. But they come to you. When they come to you, you can view them as You can deconstruct them into constraints. So I say, I've got this kind of idea of something I want to do, and now I'm going to sort of look at it in a different light that shows me the constraints that create the identity of the thing, and it almost crystallizes. I mean, I'm now using a different analogy, but it's like you grow almost a crystal from the first constraints that are attached to this idea that came out of nowhere. It's all getting a bit metaphysical, maybe. But any other questions?
I make a football game for octopuses.
What was that, sorry?
A football game for octopuses.
A football game for octopuses?
Yeah, I've got a constraint, a football game, but let's just switch it around.
So, right, so you can do this. Actually, it's a wonderful exercise, right? You can say, just throw in random constraints and see what you can come up with. You'd be surprised. Some of the best ideas that I've come up with came from seemingly random constraints thrown at me. And this is why you've got to embrace the constraint and not throw them away. This is why when people think about, like, I don't want to do a title based on a license. I never understand that. Give me a title based on a license. I've got some good constraints to start growing that crystal from. Because if you really want to create a fantastic idea out of nothing, that's so hard. Yeah, so I usually find it a lot easier to work from an idea. So if you said to me, I want a football game with octopuses, then off go the cogs. I'll probably be thinking about that in the back of my mind all week now. Maybe something will pop out at the end of it, ching. Any other, yeah?
I do find it often very necessary to break original non-negotiable like just saying killing sometimes. So I think find the original constraint you had in mind, the original theme here, it just doesn't really work out.
Oh yeah, that's when generally you throw away the prototype.
Yeah. How does that fit into your, then the moment where you say it's not negotiable constraint has been changed to this part of it?
I don't like the identity of what I'm making anymore. It really comes down to that. And so then you can look at it and you can say, well, can I save the work that I've done by changing some of the constraints and turning it into a different identity? And if you're lucky, sometimes you can. And maybe sometimes even the attempt to do that will create a new idea. It's worth trying. But a lot of the time, it's maybe better just to file it away in your subconscious and let it sort it out. And maybe a year or two later, some idea will come out, I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because when you, also got to do with when you start with your constraints, there were no constraints, you say, this game is going to be out of football. So it's got to live up to the rules of football.
Yes.
So there's some concept involved, and then you add some constraints.
Yes, that's
That's what makes it interesting. Because I don't know if it's possible for us to manage to write it through the octopus industry. That you rule that should be a little big.
This is yes.
Interesting, so you get conflict, that's an interesting basis.
That is definitely. It's definitely thinking out of the box, isn't it? That one, yeah. I think what you're saying is that you can.
You already have some constraints you don't mention.
Right. There are constraints that are often you assume. In fact, actually, there was someone's talk was talking about assumptions, or let go of your assumptions. There is a danger that sometimes we don't, as designers, fully identify all the constraints that we're working with. There are implicit constraints, and really, to improve ourselves as designers, what we need to try and do is always be aware of all the constraints. In practice, that's very difficult, but it's something to try and maybe see what happens if you break one. Experiment, Any more? Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much. Junk food society. Junk food. Junk food society. Junk food society. Look what you're doing to me. Junk food society. Now look what you're doing to me. Junk food, yeah, yeah. Junk food, yeah, yeah. When you're feeling down and you don't know what to do and you want to find some solution, you can go down to your favorite place. They will fill you with all manner of things. They'll fill you up. They'll fill you up. They'll fill you up. Right up. Junk food society. Look what you're doing to me. Junk food society. Now look what you're doing to me. Junk food, yeah, yeah. Junk food, yeah, yeah. Michael Davis on the drums with a bit of applause. Junk food. Junk food society. Junk food, yeah. Junk food society.